Hello, and welcome to the COVID chat on mobilizing people experiencing homelessness to vote in the upcoming election. I am Catherine Cavanaugh, the consumer advocate for the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, and I'll be moderating this chat today. We call these gatherings coffee chats because they are informal conversations. We invite you to get a cup of coffee or your lunch and listen and discuss. This is an opportunity for all of us to share questions, ideas, challenges, and support for one another. We hope that you will share your questions and comments throughout. One of the best parts of these coffee chats is getting to hear from the people who are doing similar work across the country. I do have to say that this coffee chat will be a little bit different today because what is a voting conversation without a last-minute curveball? I'm choosing to frame this very positively. The internet has gone out here in Baltimore where I am for about the last hour. I am hoping some wonderfully intelligent young hackers figured out how to end their school day early on a Friday. But I am trying to moderate this without internet, so we have had to adapt a few things, so just please bear with us on this. But we just are going to amend our agenda a little bit here. And so first I will give off introducing Joey Lindstrom, who is from Our Homes, Our Votes, to give us an overview about voter mobilizing and voter registration in the U.S. today. So thank you, Joey.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. I am Joey Lindstrom with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, where I'm the field director. And one of the campaigns we've been working on really since the middle of 2019 is the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 effort. Some of you might have seen it. I love that this is set up as an informal conversation, and I do have slides, but I promise to all of you that I can get through them very quickly, just to give you kind of an overview of what we've been doing and some of the considerations that we're making sure people are aware of as it relates to voting for people who are homeless. Our Homes, Our Votes, as you can see on your slide here, really looks at voting for housing organizations and advocates in three phases: voter registration, voter education, and then mobilizing people and actually getting them to the polls. We do this for a couple of reasons. As you can see, it's true that renters vote in much lower rates than homeowners throughout America, and this is even more true when you look at the disparity by income. Households with incomes below $20,000 vote at much lower rates than households with incomes above $100,000. Getting a large block of renters and people who are homeless to be a voting block and an informed voting block certainly will make an impact, because we know that the general public agrees that these issues need to be more prominently included. 83% of the public states that elected officials are not paying enough attention to the cost of housing and the need for more affordable housing. 76% say they're more likely to vote for a candidate who has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. There we go. So we're encouraging organizations throughout the country to join the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 campaign as an affiliate. There's no cost to join. We're sort of doing it really to learn which local organizations throughout the country are participating and doing work. Affiliates get, a package of T-shirts and posters and stickers. Also, they get access to branded materials and images and amplification through our various media engagement. Our amplification often comes through the Tenant Talk resource. We've done that the last couple of election years, and we're sending our current election issue to print in the coming days. We also have our Twitter account for our @OurHomesVotes that I hope you'll all follow and participate in. We also have template materials. Here's an example of a poster that can be put up in a particular property or location saying, this is where you can type in your polling location, and that polling location is open from this time to that time. We also have state-merged materials that contain information about voter registration deadlines, is early voting available, what is the mail-in ballot deadline, and so forth. There are shifting rules in each state. This year, more so than ever before, there are shifting rules about voting by mail and where early voting is available. I really encourage you all to know about ourhomes-ourvotes.org and look at the state-by-state voter information. We also do a monthly webinar. It's called Third Thursdays at 3, where we explore topics related to voting. We've done 13 of these webinars. There are 2 left. There's going to be one specific to Election Day and getting out the vote on October 15th. And then we're also going to do a final webinar on holding candidates to their promises for November 19th. One of our recent webinars was in July, where we focused on voting without an address and how people experiencing homelessness can vote. And we really walked people through some of the ways that different states approach voting without an address. And this is something that the National Coalition for the Homeless has been a leader on for many years with their You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign and resource. We reviewed all 50 states and how they approach voting for people without an address. And it's important to remember that people without an address can vote. They have that right. But the difficulty is determining which district they live in, because indeed which district they live in determines which ballot is put in their hand, which state legislator or which city council member they might vote for. So in this way, an address is important to voting. There are lots of options that exist without an address, and this matters for voters who are homeless. It matters for voters in extremely rural areas, and it's actually a very common needed tactic for American Indian tribal lands. There is a very common map option that exists in 28 states where people experiencing homelessness can draw a map of where they live, and that indicates their address for voting purposes. And that map can indicate an intersection or a park and so forth. And there's a couple of examples here about Alaska and Georgia. We also have it that in some states, some states specifically address voters who are homeless. In other states, it just sort of broadly says, voters without an address. In some states, like Colorado or Iowa or Ohio, it specifically addresses homelessness and allows people to describe where they reside. So for example, in Iowa, you could write in a park bench, or you could write in an overpass that you sleep under, if that's the case. In Ohio, people are specifically allowed to use shelters or another location as a residence for their voting purposes. And there's usually, for most state websites, an FAQ page that will discuss some of the important next steps for how to go about voting without an address. In some states, they make it a little bit tricky. In Minnesota, a voter without an address will be asked to swear under oath at their polling location that their address is correctly listed. So it's clear, though, that including clear language on the actual voter registration form, that while an address is required, voting addresses may be a map or description of a place, is important, because if it's not on the form, people won't realize it's an option, and very often people associated with the election, the people working at the polls or the people working at the clerk's office or registration, won't often know that this is an option available to people. And then states should prominently feature on their websites information for voting while homeless. This is the map of housing advocacy organizers for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. That's me and my team. And so if you're in a given state, you can copy down the contact information for myself, Tori, Kyle, or Brooke, and be in touch with us if you need additional information or if you want to be involved. So that's an overview of what we're doing, and those are my slides. Happy to take any questions, and I will turn it back over to Catherine.
Yes, thank you, Joey, for that great overview of just where we're at with voting and voting without a house. That was very helpful to kind of ground us today. And I just want to build on what Joey said and letting people know we want to hear from you. We would encourage you to share in the chat. We welcome your questions and stories. The more you engage, the better this conversation and this chat will be. I know there's a lot of people in this room and in this work doing a lot of great things. We would love to have you share your thoughts. You can type directly into the attendee chat pod at the right of your screen. Your comments will show up to all participants, and I will refer to the comments and questions as they come in. So please feel free to engage in our chat. And now we'll move on to the main portion of our conversation. Our two presenters today for this conversation, I'll be moderating a conversation between Megan Hussing, who is the Deputy Director at the National Coalition for the Homeless, in Washington, D.C., and who you already heard from, Joey Lindstrom, who's the Director of Field Organizing at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Both of these folks are going to be able to give us a national perspective on what is happening nationally in their own areas, but then also speaking from what their members and what they've heard for successful strategies on the ground. So I'm really excited to hear from our presenters today. During this discussion, next slide, sorry, during this discussion, we're going to just go through several questions and open it up. So if people have any thoughts in the room, if you have answers to these questions that you would like to share, we would love to hear from you guys. I know we have talked in the last webinar last week a lot about voter registration and how important it is to make sure people are registering to vote and all the complications there, but today's conversation we wanted to focus more on mobilizing people to vote. How are we making sure that people are actually able to get out the vote, participate in early voting or mail-in voting, and just participating in the voting process itself. So I'll start off and just asking both of you what voter mobilization activities your organizations are coordinating. So Megan, do you want to start with what you guys are doing around voter mobilization?
Sure thing. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for having me, Catherine. Excuse me. Like Joey said, the National Coalition for the Homeless has run our You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign since 1992, mostly with the federal elections that happen every 2 years. But a lot of the information kind of, it really affects all elections every year, from local, state to federal. And we do a lot of the stuff, like Joey said, we have always tracked states and what you need to register, what you might need to vote, what kind of regulations there are, and specifically looking at them with the lens of homelessness with somebody who doesn't have a home, with someone who is kind of jumping around, their address is changing. So all the information from that campaign is on our website, nationalhomeless.org. There's a big photo on the front of our site that will point you towards our voting information. We also right now have a link on our website, every page on our website, right at the top, for you to check your registration and to look for your polling place. So, I think I'll start there with just like how do we get folks to vote. Of course, registration is a huge deal, but once we get past all the barriers and someone is registered, I think knowing the polling place is probably going to be your number one step. It was mentioned a little bit what the issues are with locating, with, your address or where you're located. It affects what ballot you get, what local elections you're going to be a part of, what city council members you're voting on, that sort of thing. And so knowing your polling location is really intricately tied to that. Again, the link that we have on our website checks your registration, but also you'll be able to look for your polling place. And I think something we've encouraged organizations, shelters, other programs that work with folks who are homeless is for them to, and it might be too late to do this now, but to think about becoming a polling location. We've actually heard from the field this year that there's a few places where election boards are telling organizations that there are too many ballots assigned to like a shelter's address, and they're worried that there is some kind of voter fraud going on because there's so many folks who are using that one address. Hopefully this is not everywhere, or it's only a very isolated incident, but there can be troubles with using that address. So a shelter or other service agency being a polling location could actually get around that issue, or at least help to address it if your organization has a really good contact with your local election office. So I'll just start out there if that sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a lot of good insight there from the becoming a polling location and just being aware that there are some jurisdictions that are having some issues with mail-in ballots. So if we are encouraging people to be doing mail-in ballots, we still want to do that as early as possible if there are going to be barriers like some jurisdictions are seeing. So thanks for letting us know. Joey, do you want to shout about what you guys are doing around voter mobilization?
Well, as a Washington, D.C.-based national organization, the best thing that we do is provide tools, training, and resources to groups who are doing voter mobilization more locally. And so we've been supporting a lot of local partners in their work. Specifically, we've been doing a lot of work recently organizing housing providers, for-profit and nonprofit housing providers, who are working to get their residents registered to vote, and then helping them vote early or vote by mail, and then making sure they can get to the polls on Election Day. So we've been providing a lot of good information on the ourhomes-ourvotes.org website, and we've also produced a rundown of state laws that are applicable to organizations who are doing continued organizing around the election. So the state laws that are on the website are things like, what is the registration deadline? Is early voting available? What we make available to local organizations who are participating are some additional considerations about, can you collect up ballots and return them on people's behalf? Is it okay to help someone with their voter registration and give them a stamp to mail it in? These kinds of things. And so we kind of break that down in a state-by-state manner so that the local organizations who are helping to ensure that people have an opportunity to vote can do so successfully. We've also put together a resource on our website for tips and best practices for voting events during the pandemic. We found that some housing organizations in our network are hosting polling locations on Election Day. Others are not comfortable with that because of the safety risk of coronavirus. And so we've put together some guidelines on the best ways to hold events and make sure that people can vote safely on Election Day. The Brennan Center for Justice also has an excellent new resource on healthy voting on Election Day that I encourage everyone to take a look at.
Yes, thank you. And I will let people know, if you see the resources pod at the bottom of your screen, has a number of resources in there, including a couple of those state resources that were talked about, and the website for both the National Coalition's toolkit and the Our Homes, Our Votes landing page. So if you guys want to check out, a lot of the resources that these guys have talked about are in the resources pod, so please make sure to check out those resources for more information. And if other people have other resources that have been useful, please share those in the chat box. We'd love to hear or see other resources that people have found really useful. But I think, yeah, getting people aware of this, what's happening on each state level, is really important about what the deadlines are for registration and early votes and when early votes are open. So being aware of your state information is critical this year. As we're thinking about this year particularly, just wondering what you guys have seen as particular barriers to people's ability to vote during a pandemic, and what are the barriers that we've seen to being able to actually vote? Joey, do you want to start? I know you shared some in the initial chat.
Sure. So all of the traditional barriers continue to exist. Barriers of how do I find affordable childcare while I go to vote? Barriers of my work doesn't let me have convenient off hours that can help me get to the polling location. Or technology barriers that prevent people who are lower income from requesting a mail-in ballot that might allow them to vote safely. The best thing that we can do to overcome these barriers is education. Education of voters and education of housing providers or homeless service providers so that they know the necessary tips to address some of these barriers. For people with technology issues, the best way to overcome the voting barrier is by making sure that they have access to paper voter registration forms. For people who have mobility issues, the best way to overcome that barrier is to promote as successfully as possible voting early or voting by mail. For people who have a barrier of childcare, the best way to overcome that barrier is, again, to promote voting by mail, or if it's possible, to arrange for childcare on Election Day that is safely socially distanced. Doing so is the best practice. But there are additional barriers that low-income people and renters face, such as long lines at the polls and more interaction with voter intimidation. And so people need to be, as I said, educated successfully on things like the voter rights hotline, so that if they are attempting to vote and they are being suppressed or challenged, they can call 866-OUR-VOTE and talk to someone at the Election Protection Coalition about the experience they had at their polling location. People should also know that if they're in line by the time the polling location closes, they will have an opportunity to vote. They can't be sent home while they're in line. People should also know that the best way to avoid the lines is to vote by mail or vote early. So I think in this year we're seeing expanded vote by mail and expanded early voting, and I think promoting those options gives us the best chance at overcoming barriers to voting.
Thank you. Megan, what would you like to
Yeah,
add?
so, oh, sure, thanks, Catherine. Sorry to cut you off a little bit. So I just put a link in the chat, I think. There's a really good site that details mail-in ballot regulations by state. So in most states, I think there's 5 that you can only mail in a ballot if you have a valid excuse, which does not include the pandemic. The pandemic is not a valid excuse for mailing in a ballot in those 5 states. But everywhere else, you should be able to get a mail-in ballot. Obviously, that creates an issue when you don't have an address or when you have difficulty getting your mail. I think we all recognize that even though shelters, are more needed than ever. We're seeing additional folks losing their homes with loss of jobs and everything with the pandemic. There's a lot of shelters that are either closed. The entrance, trying to get into a new shelter if you're a new resident has been very difficult in some shelters in some places. Getting mail can be difficult. Some organizations have kind of shut down or closed their doors and are as open as they once were. So people might not be getting their mail. There are some states, I will say that, as a solution to this, there are some locations where you can go to an election board ahead of time to get your mail-in ballot if you don't have access to the place where you normally receive your mail or where you're registered. I mean, this is all a quagmire, so I think what we can do as organizations and advocates is really just get out there and help other folks who might be struggling to go through all these processes. And we've talked about preparation or education. We're definitely encouraging organizations to plan, to really get to know their state registration and voting regulations, what people need, but then also understanding the process and being able to advocate for voters through the process so that, everybody is able to cast their ballot. It's just an extra challenge for those of us who are struggling to survive each day. One of the barriers that we've always talked about is just kind of disengagement. And especially now when so many more people are struggling on a day-to-day basis, have lost jobs, have lost income. It's a difficult time right now, but I think more than ever, as much as you can do to encourage folks to vote and to support getting through, the registration and casting your ballot, the whole process is really what we as organizations and those who care about folks who are homeless or have low incomes and other barriers to voting, this is what we care about. And this is the time when we really need to put a lot of effort into helping our folks, our community members, to be able to cast their ballot.
Yeah, thank you. As both of you said, we know in a normal year it's difficult for people experiencing homelessness to vote in elections, and thinking about just doing this in a pandemic when there's also issues with the post office and voter suppression and oppression generally, it's going to be a hard time. So we want to make sure that we're engaging in these conversations as early and as often as possible. So thank you. And on those lines, I wonder, I know we've all heard stories about people who are working to overcome these challenges and thinking about strategies to overcome these barriers. I know I heard from folks in Albuquerque who were engaging their faith partners in the community to act as mailing addresses for people experiencing homelessness, to make sure that they were able to get the mail, but that the health center or different service providers weren't being overwhelmed with the amount of mail in. They got different community partners to engage and offer their address, which was a great sign. And so just want to hear from you guys what other strategies you guys have seen, ways people have tried to overcome these barriers. Megan, do you want to start?
Sure. So we held a little town hall specifically on voting, and it was aimed at people who've experienced homelessness earlier this week. And one of the examples that came up was just having your staff kind of hyper focused on outreach and anytime that you're going out into the community, if you are an organization that goes out into the community, having the information out to all staff so that everyone's kind of on the same page and everyone has the information they need to share with clients. We all have to pitch in right now.
Yeah, I think that sharing this and keeping the paperwork, including it in all outreach and all events, activities that people are doing. I know, I think on that call I heard people, as we're looking at completing the census, and more folks are out doing census, pairing voter registration with that, or this at the beginning of this year, if we're doing flu campaigns or events for flu shots, making sure we can add voter registration to those events. So just thinking about what are our contact points already with people and how can we add voter registration into that. Love it. Joey, how have you seen people overcome some of these barriers?
In addition to what I was talking about earlier?
Yes.
I think one of the key things to overcoming barriers to voting is going to be partnership between people who are low income and the organizations that provide them with services and assistance. I think renters and people experiencing homelessness care very deeply about voting, and really all they need is someone to provide them with the information, the paperwork, and the opportunity, and usually they're going to vote.
Yeah, and along those lines, maybe to both of you, I wonder if you've heard of people organizing early vote days or any driving mobility campaigns to maybe get people to the polls, or mail-in ballot drives, if there's just been any sort of activities or events that have helped really to engage a broader community in mobilization efforts. And I'll pass it to either one of you.
Early voting hasn't begun yet anywhere in the country, but I know that a lot of organizations are planning early voting efforts and to promote early voting and making sure people know where they can vote early. I will say, I'm interested in if anyone on the call has good ideas on getting people to the polls. In any other election year, most organizations would say, oh yeah, we're encouraging people to jump in this van and we're getting them to the polling location or we're taking them to the early vote site. But during a pandemic, it's just so hard to encourage people to get into an enclosed transportation option. And so what we're seeing is there aren't a lot of best practices yet on how to get people to polling locations. We're seeing a lot more effort to encourage vote by mail. But I'm interested in if others have ideas and concepts that they'd like to share.
And this is Megan. If I could just jump in too, that we are, I think, looking for best practices as well, especially when there's a number of folks who have been placed into motels, hotels, or other non-congregate settings to keep them safe or to help them recover from COVID. And there's an additional level of outreach that a lot of organizations have had to do just to manage that, to manage these scattered sites, or manage people not being all under one roof in our big congregate shelters like happens usually. So as much as can be included in that outreach that's already happening again, this is kind of throwing a wrench into registration because addresses might be changing and in a last-minute nature too. I know that next week, September 22nd, is National Voter Registration Day, and deadlines for the last date to register in a lot of states is coming up. So that's why National Voter Registration Day is at the end of September every year. But anything you can do to reach out to those people who are in non-congregate settings, or even who are hospitalized. I mean, these, really understanding where your folks are and how to reach them is kind of the first hurdle in figuring out how to figure out how to support them in getting to their polling location or to casting their ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I heard people talking about ideas for the isolation hotels, either applying for those additionally to be polling locations. I think we talked about before seeing ways to maybe incorporate people into getting voted, just seeing if we can make health centers or shelters if there's still time to make those polling locations. And I've heard other people suggest seeing if they could add quarantine hotels to that list of places that could be polling locations, or working to try to get the ballots to all of the members who are in the quarantine hotel. So I think I've heard a few good examples, but I think that's a good point. While we have a captive audience of people in hotels, we should be making sure that we're taking care of them in all of the ways that they need taken care of. So along those, I'm just wondering, what strategies have you guys found effective over the years in getting the vote out? And kind of thinking about how we could use some of those past strategies that have been really helpful in getting the vote out, and how we could apply them this year. And I think we've heard some ideas here about kind of incorporating these into other events, or letting people know early and often about what polling locations are and what the early voting options are, letting clients and consumers know that, either posting flyers around or sending out emails to folks. But just wondering from you guys if there's other strategies that you think are effective in making sure that people are able to vote.
So I'll jump in if that's okay. Not to speak too much, Joey, please stop me if you have something to add. But I think what we've always seen is, again, organizations, as much as you can, kind of get to know the situation before. By now you should have a good idea of what your state regulations are, what deadlines are. But I don't know, am I having a brain fart? I think sorry, Catherine, point me in the
effective strategies for getting, effective strategies that have worked in the past for getting people to vote that we could use now or adapt.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, everybody. So just thinking through what an organization is able to do, that's where I was going to go, and knowing just how far you can go to educate voters, clients that you're working with. As a nonprofit, we're fully able to do nonpartisan voter registration. Anything that you do just has to be nonpartisan. You can even bring up issues. You can talk about what candidates, local, state, federal candidates are saying about issues related to homelessness or housing, that in particular affect those you're working with. It's okay to do that as long as you're putting out information for all candidates, that you're not just choosing one candidate or another. You can hold candidate forums. There was a neighborhood group in D.C. last night that held a candidate forum for city council members. It was all on Zoom. So it's possible to do that, even with COVID and social distancing. So getting candidate information out there. I know that our Votes has done a good job of that on the federal level, with the presidential candidates getting information about housing and homeless platforms. But I'll also say that ballot measures are something that it is okay for nonprofits to assert a position on. Just local ballot measures, not a candidate. You can't say one way or another, what your preference is for a candidate. that would be a partisan, or you just can't support candidates, but you can support a ballot issue. So if there are a number of communities that have, added sales taxes or additional programs that'll help fund homeless services, that's something that as an organization, we can educate people about, and we can suggest, we can show what the, or tell people what the effect of some of these policies could be. But again, really the key is just being nonpartisan and making sure that if you're talking about the candidates at any level, that you're including all candidates no matter what party they're from.
Yeah,
this is
thank
Joey.
you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add on to that for a second, and just because I think the importance of talking to people about the issues that matter to them, I think is critical for getting people engaged and wanting to mobilize. I think, like as we talked about before, there is just a lot of disenfranchisement and negative feelings and uprisings these days, and I think it can feel very overwhelming for folks. So connecting with people about what matters to them and what election may matter to them. It might not be the presidential election, but is there a local election or a local fight that they really could care about, that they would want to engage for or vote because of that? So I think another part of mobilizing people is getting them passionate about the issues in the election and finding out from people what they care about and how to connect it to why they should be voting. And I think Darlene on our last call made a great point of one solid rationale is letting people know that when these elections appoint judges for life. So even though these appointments might be short term, a lot of these are appointing judges for life, and we've seen in this last administration just how many judges can get appointed and what effect that will have on us long term, and something that we can't forget about when we're talking about who's getting appointed. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, something maybe a follow-up from our conversation last week of a way to get people mobilized to vote. Joey, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of making sure people vote successfully, I really do want to emphasize the importance of making sure that staff at agencies have the correct information and that they're getting out to people the number for the voter rights hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE. I think we have pretty good processes throughout the United States for actually counting ballots. I think my bigger concern for making sure people vote successfully is, do they get a chance to actually cast a ballot? And so I think voter intimidation is an important thing to be aware of, and I think giving people the hotline number is extremely important. I also think that voter misinformation is going to be very common. We're going to see flyers, we're going to see public messages that say, you can't mail in your ballot unless it's signed by a notary. Or we might see, election day is on Wednesday. We've seen that in communities before. It's really important to make sure that the information about the election and how people vote is very present and very available to those individuals served by your agency.
Yeah, very important. Thank you. And as we're moving forward, I just want to acknowledge, I know we've got a lot of experience and expertise in the room, so if people have suggestions on strategies that you think are successful or have been successful for you and how to make sure people can vote, please share your ideas in the chat. We're also coming up on the end of time here, so if you have any questions about mobilization or registration efforts that you're setting up, or just questions on the top of your head, please ask any questions you have in the chat, and we'll be sure to answer those as we come up here. So my next question is, and I think we've got a lot of good advice, but just in things that we've talked about a lot of things, but what final advice would you have for communities trying to ensure that people experiencing homelessness can vote? And I'll pass that to Joey first.
Yeah, this is Joey. I think the best advice is making the registration process very clear on the registration forms and on the website. And then I think county clerk and city clerk's offices should actually dispatch staff to homeless service agencies to train staff members so that staff members have the best information to give out to people experiencing homelessness. to the extent that cities might or counties might be operating non-congregate sheltering, or if they might be operating motel sheltering through rapid rehousing and so forth, they should send out election information to all addresses participating in those programs to make sure that people who are homeless are aware of their voting rights and how they can vote successfully on election day and leading up to election day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Megan?
Thanks. Yeah, so I would agree with that, and also just kind of shout out to the what you said about voter misinformation and voter suppression. We know that this has been a huge issue for a few years, and it will be very big with this. Joey gave a couple of really good examples of things that you might hear or see that will be trying to distract or discourage people from voting. So that's why we say registration is key, because once you register, then there's less likelihood that your vote, there's more likelihood that your vote will be counted. There are, just acknowledge that there are the processes in place to ensure that your vote should be counted. Again, kind of shouting out the 866 Our Vote. There are lawyers all day on election day, and they're on the phone now, and they will be after the election day too. So you will get a live person, and they will be able to let you know what your legal rights are, and they'll also be able to advocate on your behalf if you think that you're being wrongly prevented from voting somehow. In most places you can submit a provisional ballot, and be able to follow up to make sure that your vote's counted. I think more than ever, we need people to advocate for themselves to make sure, we have to be a little proactive, which is unfortunate. Everyone should be able to vote without concern whether their vote's going to be counted or not, if they're doing so legally. So, again, kind of know what the regulations are, support people when they have questions, know what the resources are out there. I think I also wanted to say that the nonprofitvote.org website has some information on voting with COVID in mind, just precautions or other things that you might want to keep in mind too.
Yeah, thank you. And I see a question here in the chat where you both talked about misinformation. So just when we're talking about misinformation, where is this usually coming from? So, and I think that comes with two lines. Where is it coming from so we can help identify it and then also help correct it, the misinformation, and also just correct the source. So either one of you have ideas about, where is this misinformation coming from and what can we do about it?
This is Joey. I think the misinformation comes from a lot of interests. There have always been people affiliated with powerful interests who want to discourage low-income people and people of color from voting, and this obviously overlaps with people who are experiencing homelessness. So we've seen lots of different efforts from lots of groups that are very narrow-minded in terms of who they think should be deciding leaders. And recently, additionally, as many of you know, there have been continuous efforts by the Russians to influence the election and to spread misinformation online and through social media. And so the best practices are just to make sure that all of your staff are certain in the correct information, and they're getting that information to everybody who might be presented with counterfactual info.
And Catherine, I'll add a little bit too. We've heard things that there are some websites out there that are saying that you can use them to register. So not every single state. I believe there's 3 states where you cannot register online, but in the vast majority of states you can submit your registration online. So some people suggest that you go directly to your state's attorney general or your state's election board website to register or to process registrations. And I think this is why we're sharing the resources that we are because a lot of these are vetted. We know that these are appropriate sites. Nonprofit Vote has a portal where you can check your voter registration or submit it online. They're a trusted source. We have a link on our website that we vetted as well for checking your registration. Make sure that you're not just like following any link, that you know what site you're using to get information. And then I think we're going to see a lot of just misinformation coming out, through flyers locally. So, just echoing, make sure you know what the process is. Maybe create your own flyers that you can pass out or make available to folks in your community about, what the regulations actually are, when you vote, how you vote, where to go if you think you're having problems or should be able to vote but you're not able to.
Yeah, thank you. Good points from both of you. And we're just about to wrap up time, so I just want to say if there's any final comments from people, if you want to put in any final questions you have in the chat. I want to let people know about 2 resources before we move on. We talked about this on the last call, but there is a portal called Vote ER, which will allow people to check their registration status, register to vote, or request a mail-in ballot. So if you guys are trying to engage in some voter registration efforts, we have in the resources pod, there's a Vote ER website that is specific for NHC. So the website is just www.votevot.org/NHCHC, and that website is right in the resources pod, so you can pass that website along. You could add it. A number of us on staff here at the council have that link in our signature line on our emails so that we can try to pass it around as much as possible. We also have badge backers or phone lock screens if you want a QR code that people can scan in order to get to that link. But just wanting to be able to know, here's one way you could help engage in voter registration efforts. And another thing, next slide, as we move forward, I just wanted to let people know about 2 dates that we have coming up. So on September 22nd, that will be National Voter Registration Day. So if you're thinking about doing some activities on voter registration, or if you haven't started and you want to do something, that's a good day to kick it off. So September 22nd is going to be Voter Registration Day. And then this year, I think as we've talked about with all of the chaos in the world, that we're encouraging as many people as possible to vote early. If people don't have access to mail-in ballots or don't feel comfortable with mail-in ballots, early voting is going to be a great option to decrease their exposure on voting day. And so October 24th is National Early Vote Day. So we're encouraging people to work with your communities to set up opportunities for people to go to polling places that day, or see if your organization or your health center, a shelter, or a community partner can be a polling location, so exploring those options. And so I think just as we close up here, I would just ask maybe Joey and Megan, if there are folks in the room, if they haven't done anything this year, their organization hasn't done any voter registration or voter mobilization drives or efforts, what's the first step, the first thing you think they should be doing? Megan, do you want to start?
Sure thing. I'm going to say, we haven't talked about this much, but I'm going to say social media. It's a great way for getting information out there, and a great way for reaching, in some cases, your community. So you can always start with getting out information about the appropriate registration processes via social media or your website.
Go to ourhomes-ourvotes.org and sign up to be a local affiliate, and we'll be in touch with next steps. I think the first step is to connect with NLIHC about the resources that we have and how we can be supportive of your efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Our Homes, Our Votes, the website link is in our resources pod. So if you couldn't remember what the website was, you said, just click that link and get connected to Our Homes, Our Votes. There's a lot of good resources there about helping with voter registration. So yeah, please pay attention. There's a lot of good resources, good information out there. So just try to be discerning in how you're choosing information. But I don't see any more questions, so I will give people 10 minutes back in their day. I think my last comments here, I just want people to please, if you could join us for our next discussion. We've got another coffee chat next week, and the coffee chat next week is going to be focused on how to be a single-payer advocate during the pandemic. So as we're also talking about making sure people are voting and registering to vote, we want to also be talking about what are the topics that we care about, so learning more about single payer and how we can advocate effectively during this election for single payer. So please join us next week for that chat. And so I just want to thank everyone for their time on this call today. Thank you for being a part of the chat. You will receive a brief evaluation after this webinar closes. So if you could please take a few minutes to share your feedback, it'll help us improve our future sessions and make sure these are valuable learning experiences for everyone. And the recording of this chat will be available within 3 business days on our website. So thank you everyone very much for attending, and I hope you have a great weekend.